Welcome to Inside Politics. I'm John King. Thanks for sharing your time on a beautiful day here in the nation's capital. We hope you enjoy our new view, a spectacular view, as we count down now just 11 days until the inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump. Our new set just steps away from the Capitol steps, where the president-elect will become president of the United States 1 week from Friday. Speaking of the president-elect, pushing back this day after being attacked at the Golden Globes last night by Hollywood icon Meryl Streep. Mr. Trump insisting he was not mocking a reporter with a disability back when he launched into this on the campaign trail.
Written by a nice reporter. Now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember. Oh, maybe that's what I said.
We'll talk a bit about that. Plus, it is a huge week in politics, and it includes the first Trump news conference in more than 5 months. Confirmation hearings for several of his most important and most controversial cabinet choices. Now, the Russia hacking report certain to come up at some of those, and Trump's fellow Republicans are openly suggesting the president-elect is naive when he plays down the Kremlin election meddling and predicts better relations with Vladimir Putin.
I don't think it's all that unusual for a new president to want to get along with the Russians. I remember George W. Bush having the same hope. My suspicion is these hopes will be dashed pretty quickly. The Russians are clearly a big adversary.
And President Obama's last act, a big farewell speech tomorrow night, reflections on his 8 years in office, and listen here, some candid advice to the very different man about to succeed him.
My hope is that the president-elect, members of Congress from both parties, look at where have we objectively made progress, where things are working better. Don't undo things just because I did them. I don't have pride of authorship.
Oh, not to be too cynical, but good luck with that. With us to share their reporting and their insights, CNN's Manu Raju, Shirley Hirschfeld Davis of the New York Times, Jackie Kucinich of the Daily Beast, and CNN's Sarah Murray. President Obama preparing to say goodbye, the big farewell address tomorrow night in Chicago, and as he prepares to fade away, he's sharing his thoughts on the new guy.
You know, I've enjoyed the conversations that we've had. He is somebody who I think is not lacking in confidence, which is, I think...
Some say that about you, too.
Well, that's what I was saying. It's probably a prerequisite for the job, or at least you have to have enough craziness to think that you can do the job. I think that he has not spent a lot of time sweating the details of, you know, all the policies that...
Does that worry you?
Well, I think that can be both a strength and a weakness. I think it depends on how he approaches it. If it gives him fresh eyes, then that can be valuable. But it also requires you knowing what you don't know.
I am in a million or more ways fascinated by this moment. You have a two-term president fading from the scene, as George Stephanopoulos rightly noted. He's got a pretty healthy ego, too, and he talks about Donald Trump. All politicians do, and all presidents do at this point. But you have a man preparing to leave the White House, giving the interviews like this, the big speech tomorrow night to say goodbye, clearly trying... Oh, let's go up to New York City. Donald Trump, the president-elect, speaking at Trump Tower. Excuse me. Here we go.
Mr. President-elect, you recently wrapped up your meeting on Friday with those intel agency officials. There were some questions about your relationship with
Well, we'll talk about that on
Who do you
Wednesday.
trust more, though, Julian Assange or the NSA and ONS?
We'll be talking to you very soon.
How did your meeting go, Mr.
that Russia was doing the hacking in order to help?
We'll talk to you about that at another time.
Can you tell us
We're
about
going to be, yes, we had a great meeting. It's jobs. You just saw what happened with Fiat, where they're going to build a massive plant in the United States, in Michigan. And we're very happy. And Jack and I are going to do some great things. Small business, right?
We'll focus on small business.
There's some concern about your confirmation hearings coming up.
They're going great. Confirmation's going great.
No, they haven't started yet. Are they?
I think they'll all pass. I think every nomination will be, they're all at the highest level. Jack was even saying, I mean, they are at the absolute highest level. I think they're going to do very well.
There's some concern about Jeff Sessions in particular.
No, I think he's going to do great. High quality man. Thank you, Jack.
Can you speak a little bit more, Mr. President-elect? I know you're going to talk more on Wednesday, but about your concerns about Russia.
President-elect Donald Trump bit of a surprise coming into the lobby of the Trump Tower to say hello or goodbye, I guess, there to his guest, Jack Ma, the CEO of Alibaba. We'll get back to President Obama in a minute, but we got the president-elect pops into the rally there. Sarah Murray, you've spent a lot of time around the president-elect. He's having these meetings. This is another opportunity for him to say, see, since my election, there are a lot of businesses who think they're going to get a better tax climate. They're going to get a better pro-business environment, and they're moving jobs into the United States. Do we read much more into that?
No, I mean, he tends to do this when he feels like he has an impressive guest and when he feels like he wants to have a photo op of the two of them in front of the cameras together. That's the best way to get that photo op when he's working at Trump Tower. His ideal situation is someplace like Mar-a-Lago or Bedminster, where he can be far enough away to not have to talk to the press, but still have them see his impressive guest. You'll note there that he didn't answer any real questions about his feelings about Russia or the hacking or anything else. It's really leading the news there. But it is an opportunity for Donald Trump to say, look, as president-elect, I'm bringing all these influential business figures in to see me, or like we saw a couple weeks ago, Kanye West.
It's actually a surprising amount of restraint, too, for Donald Trump going before the cameras, being asked just about Julian Assange and about the Russia hack, and deciding not to take the bait, not to answer questions when he hasn't not answered really any questions about those issues. But it just shows you how it sort of raises the stakes for this week's news conference, the first in 6 months, since July 27th. What is he going to say, not just about those issues, but where is he going to come down on Obamacare? Does he want a replacement to happen right as the repeal happens, and any number of issues going forward, because he has not answered questions on those topics.
But it's also an example of how he really likes to take these questions on his own terms. So he'd rather address some of these issues over Twitter, where he has, his own platform that is unfiltered and his words. And
no dissent.
Exactly. Or at the news conference where, he's going to be selecting who he calls on, and the set of issues that he's going to be talking about are what he wants to be talking about. Today, this was, as Sarah said, about his high-profile guests and all of the progress he thinks he can make as president in trying to bring jobs back. But if this is not the venue where he wants to take this question, he just won't take it. On the other hand, he will take a call from a reporter in the middle of the night, or sometimes unsolicited call a reporter in the middle of the day when he feels like it's to his advantage to do so.
That is, and we're going to get to this throughout the hour, but that is one of the, again, I mentioned at the top of the show, I'm fascinated in a million ways at the moment. We have a two-term president leaving. We have a new president who has Washington on edge, including his own party, coming in just 11 days. And he's getting a lot of advice. He's getting a lot of advice from Republicans. He just met with the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. He's getting a lot of advice from his own people. He's getting a lot of advice from outsiders, whether it's on Russian hacking or when and when not to answer questions. He's also getting a lot of advice from the outgoing president who, remember the history, Donald Trump tried to delegitimize the Obama presidency by questioning whether Barack Obama was born in the United States. The president, though, has tried to be polite. He's not forgetting that history, but he's tried to be more polite. Listen to him here trying to tell Donald Trump, sir, the world you're about to enter into is very different from anything you could comprehend.
The main thing that I've tried to transmit is that there's a difference between governing and campaigning. So that what he has to appreciate is, as soon as you walk into this office after you've been sworn in, you're now in charge of the largest organization on earth. You can't manage it the way you would manage a family business. You have to have a strong team around you. You have to have respect for institutions and the process to make good decisions, because you are inherently reliant on other folks.
He's being very polite. His language is very measured. But if you paid attention to what President-elect Trump has done and the history with President Obama, you get the sense he says you can't run it like a family business. You have to have respect for institutions in the process. The president's trying to say something that's a lot more pointed than the language than those words convey.
Well, it's fascinating to watch, because what you get from President Obama is it seems like he's really trying to leave some channels of communication open between him and Donald Trump, that he actually feels like when he leaves office, he might actually have some ability to influence Donald Trump and sort of help him figure out how to be president. But implicit in what he's saying is really a rejection of Donald Trump's entire approach to governing. Because when he says governing is not like campaigning, Donald Trump is still, we see, in attack mode almost constantly. He's in a defensive crouch. And that's not a way you can be president. But by saying it in that way, I think President Obama is trying to get in a much tougher critique of Trump than it sounds like he's making.
And the question is, will it filter through to the president-elect? Because a lot of Republicans would watch that interview or watch us replay that clip and say, come on, they made the same criticism of President Obama early on, that the early months of the Obama White House that he forgot that he wasn't on campaigning anymore.
Still, when the way Obama went into the White House, it's different. It seems like President-elect Trump really does want to shake things up. He's encouraging his nominees, who will become, in theory, secretaries, to go in and change the organizations that they're taking over. And he's going. What it seems like and what it sounds like is that he's going to sort of let them have a long leash. He's not going to be involved in their day-to-day. So in terms of, we'll have to wait and see how much they do it, but they think that they have a mandate to really to change it in a different way, to really shake things up and change the way how Washington works, which everybody says, but this seems a little different.
And John, it'll be so interesting, Obama talking about respecting the institutions. How does he deal with the institution behind us, Congress? And the way that Obama dealt with it in 2009 is that he essentially let members of Congress write the stimulus bill coming in. He let them lead on the health care approach. He did not want to come in with a heavy hand and drop a big bill and try to push it through because they thought that would backfire. That's what happened during the Clinton years. They changed up their approach. What does Donald Trump do coming in? Does he let members of Congress try to draft and write his agenda, or does he try to come up with something and try to get his public support and Republican support behind that yet? I don't think we know that, and a lot of it also will do with Mike Pence and his role on Capitol.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting to see how far Donald Trump is willing to put himself out there on something like repeal and replace for Obamacare. I mean, we saw him firing off warnings on Twitter last week that essentially put Republicans on the Hill on notice. Be careful what you replace this with. Be careful that you're not stripping people of all of their benefits and leaving them out there to dry. If you're a Republican on the Hill who's trying to come up with a replacement for Obamacare, that's a strong warning. That sends a signal that, look, if you guys screw this up, I'm not necessarily going to take the blame for it. I might be out there blaming members of my own party if people aren't happy. Because one of the things Trump is really good at is having his pulse on what is popular and what makes him popular. So if people start to reject whatever the replacement is, if there is an outcry from people about their options for health insurance going forward, I think that it's a possibility Donald Trump washes his hands and blames it on the Hill.
And he's boxed them in on that point. Before we go, you mentioned his use of Twitter. It's come up a couple of times. When President Obama took office, it was a big deal that he said he was going to keep his BlackBerry. If you want to rewind the tape and go back 8 years, it was a big deal. He was going to keep a BlackBerry so that he could keep in touch with his friends. He said he was worried about being in the bubble of the presidency. He wanted to keep that BlackBerry. It concerned the Secret Service. It concerned people who worry about cyber hacking. Yes, they worried about it back then, too. For Donald Trump, his social media weapon of choice, technology of choice is Twitter. The current president of the United States saying, sir, when you drop the elect, you better be careful.
Clearly, this worked for him, and it gives him a direct connection to a lot of the people that voted for him. And I've said to him, and I think others have said to him, that the day that he is the president of the United States, there are world capitals and financial markets and people all around the world who take really seriously what he says. And in a way that's just not true before you're actually sworn in as president.
I assume he understands. I think he means the advice, and I think he actually means it president to president, if you will. But I assume he knows that you could fill a football stadium with the people who have told Donald Trump to dial it back on Twitter, and that ain't a safe bet. It's not going to happen.
I mean, that's what works for him on Twitter, and I think that's the reason that he does it. And so the idea that he would somehow be more restrained, like he told an interviewer that he would be right after the election on Twitter when he gets into the Oval Office, seems far-fetched.
A little far-fetched. Everybody sit tight. You just saw Donald Trump in the lobby of Trump Tower. He wouldn't take a couple of questions. He said, I'll see you soon. Up next, Donald Trump, yes, he will see us soon, holding a formal news conference Wednesday, his first in more than 5 months. If you got a chance, what would you ask?